Hello and welcome to the Potential Psychology Podcast. I'm your host, Ellen Jackson, and it's my mission to share the science of human behaviour in a practical, fun and inspiring way. In each podcast episode, I interview an expert from the fields of psychology, well-being, leadership, parenting or high performance. I pick their brain to uncover what they know about living well, what tips do they have for you and I quiz them about how they apply their expertise in their own life. Join me as we discover simple, science-backed ways to live, learn, flourish, and fulfill your potential. Welcome back to the Potential Psychology Podcast, where we explore the science of being human in a very human way. And I have an amazing and thoughtful and very helpful conversation for you today, especially if you have ever grappled with anger. And I don't necessarily mean anger in that high-intensity, screaming rage kind of way, although today's conversation certainly applies to that. I mean anger that might look and feel like irritation or frustration or short-temperedness or just, that feeling. We all get it. We all do it. Whether it's snapping at the kids or our partner or frustration with someone at work or irritation when we receive poor customer service or that sense of outrage when someone posts an opinion on social media that we just can't abide. And my guest today, who is an expert in anger, argues that while anger in all of its forms is the most commonly experienced negative emotion, who knew? It's also pointless. It doesn't serve you emotionally or strategically to get narky at someone or some things. There are far wiser ways, he says, of making your point. And this has got me thinking this week about how we make our point, how we influence other people, how we might go about convincing them or bringing them around to our ideas or encouraging them to do something, because that's a goal that we all have in different ways just about every day. Whether it's convincing our kids to tidy their rooms or asking for support or help to launch a product or idea or lobbying for a cause or trying to sell a product, it's all about interacting and relating and negotiating and influencing. And as often happens since I recorded today's interview, this topic has come up several times, both with the leaders that I work with in the community leadership program that I facilitate, talking about how you get a community-led initiative off the ground when you don't have formal or positional power. And also with the leaders that I've been coaching, talking about how we might influence staff to seek mental health support or understand where certain behaviour is coming from so that we can improve some performance issues. And it largely stems, it seems, from empathy, being able to really understand where someone else is coming from. And my guest today has a really insightful take on empathy. He says that empathy is not necessarily an act of kindness. But that's something we get into towards the very end of this intriguing conversation. So let's listen in, shall we? My guest today is Dr. Stephen Laurent, a clinical psychologist based in the inner suburbs of Sydney with a special interest in anger, what it is, why we feel it, and perhaps what we can do about it when we feel it's really not serving us or worse, causing problems in our everyday life. Stephen completed a PhD in psychology at Sydney University, a master's in clinical psychology at the University of New South Wales, and before beginning his studies in psychology, Stephen completed a double major in philosophy and formal logic at the Sorbonne in Paris. He currently operates a generalist psychology practice in Sydney. He's the co-author of The Anger Fallacy, Uncovering the Irrationality of the Angry Mindset, and its associated workbook with Ross Menzies. And he's working on a new book at the moment, focusing on love and relationships. Welcome, Stephen.
Thank you. And what a pleasure.
It's great to have you here. As I was just saying off air, I received a copy of The Anger Fallacy through your publishers, which was published a few years ago now. But it's a fascinating book, and it's a topic that we haven't explored in any depth previously on the podcast. But one, as we were just saying, is really applicable to anybody who's human.
Yes. Very inclusive.
Very inclusive and certainly applicable. I flicked through it and went, oh, wow, yes. Oh, fascinating. That's intriguing. Thinking both about myself and other people around me and perhaps some of my clients in workplace situations. So I thought we might explore a little bit about anger.
Interestingly, I think it's the most commonly experienced negative emotion.
Really? And what makes you say that?
Well, research would suggest it from polling surveys. Just if you randomly call up participants and ask what they're feeling at a given time, then anger is number one by a long shot, over and above, say, sadness or anxiety or shame or guilt or any of the other negative emotions.
Wow. And do you think that's because we are angry, or is it because it's an emotion that's easier to label somehow?
No, we're assuming that there's no incentive for them to lie. These are anonymous surveys. And also, if we look at journaling and diaries, anger's right up there. If we include, remember, irritability, we're not talking about people flying off into a rage, but just the annoyances of everyday life. I think it's number one. I mean, Buddhism places it front and center, and I think modern Western psychology should too. It's also the first distinct negative emotion that we feel developmentally as babies. Obviously, a kind of a diffuse distress. It's not any one emotion in particular occurs first, but the very first distinct one, marked by a kind of frowny face and a pushing away.
I could see that. Yes, I could see the facial expressions there. Obviously, nobody else can.
And the distinct, markers of anger come even before, say, sadness proper or fear in babies. So it's very, very ancient and early and omnipresent. That's why I think it deserves a lot of attention for humans generally, like you put it, and why this book we wrote was intended for not just those with really crippling anger issues, but just for the everyday reader.
For all of us to understand a little of what's going on. So what is anger? I mean, you described it as a negative emotion, and I know there's always a challenge around putting value labels around things like emotions, but it's obviously a feeling. Why do we have it?
Well, on that epithet of it being a negative emotion, that's sort of what's paradoxical about anger, is that it's obviously unpleasant. It's sort of a noxious feeling. No one wants to wake up angry or would take a pill that made you just feel angry for no reason if we're on the market. And yet, and here's the paradox, and yet people do seem to like their anger and not want to do anything about it. And in fact, research suggests of all the negative emotions, it's the one people least wish to reduce or control. So that, I think, is something that needs explaining. Why do we like it if it's so unpleasant? And why do we seem so keen to maintain it and talk about it and be vindicated in it, as opposed to, say, anxiety or sadness? People are only too keen to seek help for those emotions, or guilt, shame, and other more vulnerable emotions. Anger, people seem very fond of it. It's a mystery. That's sort of where I start the book, because I think that that's part of the challenge in anger management, is talking people out of it, convincing people it really isn't in their interests, that it's not all it's cut out to be.
And hence the anger fallacy.
Really should be fallacies. There's so many misconceptions about anger, but certainly front and center is this idea that it's in your interests to get angry with people, that it gets results.
So why do we like it then? Why? Because as soon as you've described that, I can sort of see all sorts of instances where we might, that indignation that you get, in social media and spheres like that, or people's anger at politicians, or, there is a bit of a love-hate thing there, isn't there? So why is that?
There's so many different reasons. I mean, we all love telling friends about that time we stormed up angrily to the counter and we demanded something and got our way, and angry people fantasize about people in the cafe clapping, or which rarely happens. People are mostly embarrassed or contemptuous. But yeah, people imagine that it's a bit of a power trip and that they come out, looking good. And that, on social media, all those sort of politicized, indignant displays of anger, people feel a badge of honor. Shows that they're, vehemently wedded to the cause, and it's a sort of flag-waving, virtue signaling kind of emotion. And I guess people feel that if I get angry, then that's because I'm standing up for myself, standing up for what's right. It's a very righteous emotion. And people like to be right and to be righteous, and they don't want to be talked down from that. It seems as though when you're talking them down from their anger, it's as though you're trying to talk them down from their position, from their strongly held beliefs to which they're wedded. So that, I think, is how I would explain why people are fond of it. I just think that that's a bunch of baloney.
And so why is it a bunch of baloney? I mean, again, yes, I can see how it, people might feel that it comes from a place of principles and principles are, there's almost like ideas of integrity and things like that come to mind.
Well, have your principles, but you can have your principles without losing your temper. Mm-hmm. You can have your principles in a wiser way. You can believe in what is right and have some very passionate goals and values that you pursue, relentlessly, and yet not be angry. I just think the anger is neither here nor there. Anger shows that there's something in the world you just can't tolerate. You can't get your head around. And that you're judgy, of others and their behavior, and that you know better. And the book essentially is a very long and thorough argument against that position. I argue I'm not trying to talk anyone down from pursuing their goals and values to the utmost, on the contrary, but do so without anger. Also, look, let's be realistic about how anger actually plays out in the world. Most of the time, it's not at racial injustice or at broader social causes. It's at your kids who are on Facebook for too long, or your husband who forgot to pick up the milk. 85% of anger is directed at loved ones, based on polls and diaries and journaling and things like that. So I don't know how much it's really fighting the good cause and how much of it's just being cranky, being an irritable, slightly out of control person who doesn't tolerate misbehavior or what they perceive as misbehavior. So look, if all you had was that 15% that was directed at strangers or broader social causes, you'd be doing pretty well. But even there, I feel a calmer, wiser approach is still preferable.
Let's come back to that, because I'm intrigued now about the 85% and that everyday irritability, which I suspect for many people, probably at times myself included, we just accept it as a kind of normal state of being. I mean, as you said, you pointed out that it's the most commonly experienced negative emotions.
The smell of napalm in the morning.
Yeah. What forms does that anger take? What people recognise in themselves or those around them, their loved ones potentially, that perhaps they haven't even considered as being anger, and how does that play out?
Look, the whole gamut from finger tapping impatience through mild irritability and annoyance up to being a little peevish, bit pissed off, angry, mad, furious, and enraged. It's all of a piece. It's all within that same family of emotion. It's just to a greater or lesser degree. And how does it display? Well, you'd know as well as anyone else. It's people just being short with each other, being intolerant with each other, being arseholes. That's how. And at its more egregious end, it's people being abusive, bullies. And in the home, it's a lot of child abuse and domestic violence that I see in my clinic, to lesser or greater extent. We might think, well, that's the extreme end. But as we know, there's many forms that abuse and violence can take, other than the more obvious ones. And I think you can be an angry parent. Maybe you never pick up a broom handle, but still you can make the environment really noxious for your child. And in couples, it's the same. Instead of just having heart-to-hearts and dealing with matters as they arise, people get angry so much. Once you see it as an irrational and futile emotion, you'll see more and more that people waste so much energy being angry at each other rather than just getting real, talking from the heart, trying to resolve problems as they arise.
I think you're right. I think that probably most of us, when we hear the word anger, when we think of anger, we think of that extreme end towards the rage end of the scale. We think of physical manifestation, red face, fury. we're not necessarily thinking about all of those minor, well, I say minor, should be, but not necessarily minor, because obviously they all build up, but that irritability, the niggly, perhaps the resentment, the eye rolling, all of those sorts of things that come through. Why is that futile? Why is that unhelpful? I think we probably know in sense, but if we can put some words around it.
No, I don't think we do know. I think a lot of people, certainly those prone to anger, sort of actually, when push comes to shove, will admit they think it's useful. I think it gets results. You ask your child once, go brush your teeth. You ask him again a little more sternly. And then finally you raise your voice and threaten. And then he goes and does it. And so you say, well, there you go. Escalation was useful.
That worked.
And not realizing, of course, that there were many other ways to establish consequences and get habits and routines up that you just failed to use. It's just I see that as a bit of a breakdown in the system when you're having to yell at your child to get him or her to do some small task. I think there's a bigger problem. Parenting should, for the most part, be calm and not coercive, ideally. It should be clear that it's in the child's best interests to just clean his teeth promptly and without fuss, because precedent has been set. Similarly, you might think in a relationship that you yell and have it out, and then after the argument, kiss and make up, and you think, well, that was useful. And you've misattributed to the anger what was probably more down to you talking about the thing or going there in the first place. It's not that you achieved the reconciliation or the result because of the anger, but despite of it. Anger is, often given too much credit. And the thing is that occasionally, look, we concede that occasionally anger works in the short term. Clearly, threatening and sulking and stuff often gets your romantic partner to comply. But often these victories are hollow. You get an apology, but it's not a sincere one. They just want to placate you. Or you get them to back down, but they resent you. And so now there's a sort of a bad vibe in the relationship or the household. Or, you strike up a win here, there, occasionally, intermittently, but overall you just erode the quality of the relationship. The person just doesn't want to be with you, which is a bigger problem than whether they stack the dishwasher properly. You sort of make some small win here or there, but then lose the bigger battle of a close, warm relationship.
So what's driving that then? Why is anger our default? Is it something within us, or is it a lack of knowledge and understanding or awareness of how else to go about it? Is it what we've been shown growing up and therefore modelled for us? Why do we so quickly default to that, what is ultimately, from the way you've described it, unhelpful response?
Yeah, well, I just think it's because, we're animals and we're not very thoughtful most of the time, let's be honest. And anger's not something we strategize. It's not a Machiavellian ploy. You haven't thought 3 or 4 moves in advance when you get angry. You just snap. That's a lot of it. There's a subgroup of angry individuals who are impulsive. Kids with ADHD are a lot angrier. Clearly, there's one answer there for it's just people are thoughtless and they just react. And if they did give it more thought, they'd think, okay, all right, that wasn't the best way to go about that. That is often what happens, right? That's the pattern. You initially snap thoughtlessly, just as a reflex. Something irritates you and you yell and scream, then you calm down and there's a few more conversations, then you sleep on it, and then eventually you apologize and say, sorry, I shouldn't have lost my temper, but... And then you have the conversation you probably should have had in the first place. A constructive one. And by the way, that is also sort of what makes anger seem less harmful than it really is because you can always kiss and make up and then have the real conversation that needed to happen later and then conclude, oh, well, it wasn't so bad. But I still think that if you're in a relationship where there's a lot of arguing and angry reactions, sulking, slamming of doors, hanging up and constant recriminations, it really gets unpleasant. And no one wants to be in one such relationship. Angry people really prone to anger, often when they come through my door, it's because it was a sort out your anger or we're over kind of conversation that preceded it.
Yeah.
It's often the spouse that is the catalyst, So
something's gone horribly wrong.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, who would want to live with someone who's constantly angry? What could be more unpleasant?
So there's living with someone who's constantly angry. And then I suppose there's that experience for us personally as well. As you said before, it is obnoxious. It doesn't feel good to be angry. And I suspect that it comes along with a lot of consequential emotion around perhaps guilt, shame, regret, those sorts of things.
That's right. Anger, once the dust settles, usually leaves a feeling of shame, embarrassment. And that's if it's in the privacy of your own home, let alone if it's in public. There's also humiliation. There can also be just fallout to mop up the consequences of your behavior as well. You're constantly having to backpedal and apologize. And it's not great. Personally, I really hate the feeling. I think another reason, just going back to our initial talking point, another reason it's sort of ambiguously positive, negative, is because while anger itself is unpleasant, revenge is very pleasant. It may be a dish best served cold, but it is a dish. And often, interestingly, when research has been done on what's going on in angry people's heads, a lot of what they're doing is anticipating or imagining or simulating revenge. They're imagining what they'll tell that person. They're imagining what they'll write in that angry letter, or the pithy comeback, or how they're going to get justice, get their own back in one way or another. And those little fantasies are pleasant. And so that, I think, is somewhat confusing phenomenologically. Makes some of the experience of anger accidentally pleasant in your own head because you imagine getting your own back. Of course, the truth is that given how unsuccessful anger often is, the vast majority of the time you aren't getting these victories. You might imagine them, but then you're not getting them. And certainly going to bed angry about something that you're not going to probably be able to do anything about is extraordinarily disempowering and unpleasant.
So we might have these fantasies that provide us with this kind of positive or reward type. We get that sense of reward because we imagine what it is we're going to say, what it is we're going to do. More than likely, we don't ever say it or do it because perhaps the anger's dissipated.
Or we do, but it doesn't get the intended result.
That's exactly what I was about to say. Was that exactly. We do, because I've seen this in workplaces in some of the work that I do, that people have that and then they take it down that path and it doesn't turn out anything like they imagine. They end up in stickier and stickier situations that get messier, more complex, and have all sorts of other unhelpful repercussions that they weren't necessarily expecting.
I mean, how often do you let someone have it and they just totally fall on their sword and say, "Oh my God, I'm so sorry. I totally agree with your point of view. I was really wrong." Of course, if they were that already sold to what you were saying, you probably wouldn't have needed to get angry. It sounds like they were already sorry. But most of the time they don't agree. Almost by definition, you're in a conflict and the other side doesn't see things the way you do. They're not going to fall.
Hence the conflict.
Yeah, that's right. No, most of the time they don't agree. And so, anger actually usually elicits in the other person anger.
And that's where you get that escalation.
And then their anger, rather than their apology or their submission, causes further anger in you. They're not seeing your point. They're not even admitting it. And that infuriates you more. And you get this rage spiral.
And that's, I think, where you can see when you do get that escalation and that rage spiral, if it really is that kind of aggressive, angry conflict, we can see the negative repercussions of that. Perhaps not in the moment, but with time. But if it's more of a passive response that you get from someone, and I'm thinking back to those examples of your child, for example, where you are getting cross with them because you want them to do something, and so they just kind of give in and do it, we don't necessarily see the repercussions for the relationship in the same way, do we?
Not immediately, but then when you go to kiss them goodnight, there's not a lot of warmth there, and you wonder why they don't tell you things, why they lie, and it comes out in various ways. They sulk. And if there's a good cop, bad cop dynamic between the parents, they'll go to the other parent. There's all sorts of things, because often parents do want to have it both ways. They want to yell at their children and also be their friends and have a warm, honest, open relationship with them. Yeah, you're going to have to pick a lane there. Yes. It's difficult to have the one and the other at the same time.
Yeah. So for some of those, it is that longer game, isn't it? To think about, well, what are the implications of this over time if I keep behaving in this way, how are they going to respond? And what's that doing for us and our relationship? And I can see this too, if the pattern of, anger and then a kind of a passive shutdown response, which might not look so obviously detrimental, but clearly over time is going to cause that individual to disengage really from the relationship.
That's right. Even the most positive reaction you could imagine, where they apologize, I think more often than not still does leave its traces. If you've ever been on the receiving end of someone really losing it at you and you've kind of apologized, and there's still that, oh God, that was an unpleasant moment. And one can only imagine the parallel universe in which you came at that same thing calmly, or, with a sad tone or just a neutral tone. And it's a very different looking relationship. I mean, we're still at home, right? But at work, it goes down like a lead balloon. If you're the subordinate and you get angry, you get into a lot of trouble. It's not appropriate. If you're the boss and you get angry, it's not likable. If you get very angry, it looks like you're out of control. It erodes your leadership because there's nothing less alpha than someone who can't control his emotions and who's constantly blowing his top. There's nothing more charismatic in a leader than self-control and a tolerant, respectful attitude towards subordinates. Yeah, we also admire firmness. I'm not saying be soft. This is a distinction which must be drawn very sharply. I'm saying I don't think your anger is useful, but keep your position, hold your ground, and you can place boundaries. You can be very severe if you wish. You can fire someone calmly. You can break up with someone calmly. You can call the police. You can place boundaries and consequences, for your children. But do so tactically. Do so because it's your best move. Don't make these decisions angry. Anger will always tilt you toward the more punitive and reactive and usually obnoxious kind of reactions. One of the negative consequences for the individual getting angry is that you can't think clearly when you're angry. You lose all your creativity, and you just as you can see in how people's vocabulary kind of devolves.
It does, doesn't it? Very limited to certain words.
and when angry people get stuck and they just repeat themselves, they just get on a loop. It's because they're really on one cylinder cognitively. You just can't think clearly. You just get in a groove.
Is this why, as parents, we tend to default to the "because I'd said so"?
Because I said so. Just do it. Why are you doing it? How dare you? Just again and again, these little stock phrases come out.
Yeah. I can't think of a good reason now except that I want you to, and I said so.
Nike, just do it. Yeah, obviously sense of humor goes out the window, creativity, vocabulary, and of course, you just can't even consider certain win-win type. From a negotiation point of view, in the book I explore all that literature, which is interesting. Good negotiators try to think up win-wins. That's the art of the deal. I'm not sure Trump outlines that in his book, but ultimately a great negotiator is someone who's really good at hearing the other person's wants and needs and trying to look for some outside-the-box win-win, and who doesn't do anything to put off the other person in the negotiation by being angry, certainly. So your ability to negotiate well goes out the window. It's definitely an emotion that's not doing you any favors, intrapersonally or interpersonally.
Yeah, so it feels bad. It's destroying relationships, work-wise or personally. It's stopping you from clearly operating as your best self in any capacity, whether as a parent or as a leader. You lose your language, your cognitive skills, your problem solving, all of that kind of stuff. But so far, we're not seeing a whole lot of positive reasons for it.
And all of this bears mentioning. I don't think that most people are sold to that, who have anger problems at least. And so I do not make the mistake I think a lot of anger management books make, which is just to assume that the reader's totally sold already to the venture and to anger being completely useless and noxious, and they just want to know how to treat it. No, I think part of the treatment is actually selling the antidote and convincing that the person that anger is not in their interests, making a case against it. Then and only then will they be receptive to treatment.
So it comes back to that paradox piece that we spoke about, that clearly there are benefits that people are getting, whether that's that, fantasizing about revenge and what it is they're going to say. One of the things that comes to my mind, I don't know if this is true or not, but almost a degree of competition, that there's kind of I have to win this situation. Is that part of what might be coming into play for people?
Yes, absolutely. Anger, especially in arguments, often runs parallel to a kind of a power play between two people. And once you've, made your position clear, often, unfortunately, you've painted yourself into a corner, because now if you concede, you'll look weak. And there need to be face-saving ways to get out of that, because if it's between losing face or patching things up, people will often stubbornly stick to their position anyway, because at that point, And look, that's why, in part, we have a chapter devoted to this idea of how power is not just stubbornly sticking to a position or being righteous and angry, but power has a lot more to do with self-control and being calm and sophisticated and a diplomat, being able to show the person you understand and to have the humility to say, yeah, all right, okay, I can see that now. I was wrong. That's all right. Let's do things differently. There's a power in that too. Men especially, but all of us, we need to rethink what it is to win in these settings. Where are the goalposts exactly? I mean, you bullied your spouse into backing down and doing something he or she didn't want to do. Is that really power? Is that the kind of power you're after? There's a difference that's interesting, actually, between power and prestige. And this difference, by the way, I think goes very deep in our line, our evolutionary line. There are two kinds of ways you can make your way in the world of status and power. One is to be strong and show your opponents that you're not to be messed with, and to intimidate, essentially. It's the Machiavellian way, It's better to be feared than loved, that idea. And then there's being popular, the popular leader, the charismatic leader, and to have the kind of prestige and likableness that is also its own form of power. And I think that the latter is ultimately better. It's a more secure form of power, and it's what people would prefer if given the choice. They'd prefer perhaps the first kind, the bullying kind, over and above just being completely alienated or subjugated. But of the two forms of power, a power where people voluntarily want to do what you ask and want your approval and like you and admire you, is certainly the better one. And that's where I think a case can be made against anger, because often this digging your heels in, wanting to be right, wanting to get one over the person you're angry with or in the conflict with, I think is the pursuit of only one kind of power, the cheaper and less long-lasting, less desirable of the two. And we suggest that it be substituted, that the better form of power be substituted for one of being a person that your partner admires, a person capable of humility, rethinking things, getting their point of view, who's intelligent, thoughtful.
And that, I think, comes back to that point you made earlier about that kind of wisdom, approaching these situations with a bit of wisdom and thought. And I think we can all understand that logically, that prestige, likability piece makes much more logical sense. And of course, yes, we would all choose that perhaps over this more angry, domineering, aggressive, if that's the right word, form or approach to a situation. My question is, if we know this logically, why don't we do it?
Well, I don't think we do, logically. How many people have stopped to really meditate on how to behave in conflicts? That's what this is an opportunity to do. This book is for the average person or someone with anger problems to stop and actually reflect once and for all in their life on the long-term and short-term and medium-term consequences of their behavior, their ways of thinking when it comes to conflict. I just don't think that many people have stopped to think about it. I hadn't. And I'm a very thoughtful guy who's been a psychologist and did a degree in philosophy. I don't think the average person has. I do think that these arguments are compelling. I always get my patients, if they choose, to read the book, and I always ask them the same thing. I say, please take a pen and scribble any thoughts as you're reading about things, especially things you don't agree with. I want to know arguments that just don't really resonate for you. But no, most of the time, people go, yeah, that is compelling. I'd never really stopped to think about that.
Just not thought about it before.
Just hadn't thought about it.
Yeah.
It's that simple. I don't think we need to get more deep and meaningful about why we do this. I think
just actually stop and reflect.
Yeah, I guess it isn't that good a look, is it? I bullied my wife into having sex with me because she ought to, because I'm angry and she doesn't want me to be angry. That's not really that powerful a tableau, is it? I just screamed at my 7-year-old daughter to tidy her room. This is not the kind of power, if people stop to think about it, that we want in life. We'd much rather be popular.
If step one is actually just stopping for a minute and paying some attention and engaging in a bit of reflection and thinking about what you're doing, step two, I'm guessing, is part of that, and I know you cover this in the book, is starting to unpick a bit of, what is driving that for you as an individual. So what are the underlying thoughts, emotions that mean that you are, engaging in that sort of behavior? Exactly.
That's the next step. Monitor. Become your own observer. Like it's the first step in a lot of behavioral change. Your dietitian might get you to just track for a week or two what it is you eat, what your habits are, what your patterns are, and someone wanting to work on your sleep might get you to monitor your sleeping patterns for a couple of weeks. And that's the very first step in anger management. Monitor your anger for a few weeks. You don't even have to do anything different. Just diarize. Track every instance of irritation and annoyance, and let's have a little look. What are the patterns? You can just give each instance of anger a rating out of 10, where 10 is maximum rage and 1 is just barely noticeable irritation. And if we have a look just at the incidents where you experienced anger over 6, was there a pattern to them? You can do a little bit of number crunching in various ways. If we did a pie chart of who your anger is directed at, the biggest piece be your spouse or your boss or your sister. And let's have a look at what the themes are. And of course, I usually tell my clients that the purpose is data collection for me. And that is true. But it is also its own therapy. Because as soon as you become an observer, someone who's held accountable for all these little reactions, you become more self-conscious. And a lot of it actually dissipates.
Creates the change.
Yeah, that's right. A little bit like, say, your chiropractor. If you gave you one of those devices you put on your back for posture, where every time you slouch, it buzzes. That's just an attention-raising, awareness-raising device. That's all it does. And that alone, actually, most of the time gets people to improve their posture. So, yeah, that's the very first step. Monitor, let's have a little look. Collect some data. 2-3 weeks is usually enough. Become a little bit of a scientist of yourself. Become an objective observer. And unless those weeks have been unrepresentatively good or bad, but if they're, that pretty much captures it. If we start getting diminishing returns on new information, if in the 3rd week there's nothing new that we hadn't already circled or brought attention to, then we're about done. So that is step 1, yeah.
And so when people look at these themes and patterns, and obviously every individual is going to be different, but are there themes and patterns within the overall? I know in the book you talk about, the cognitive basis of anger and things like shoulding, which is a term we use in psychology. What are the sorts of things that are going on in people's heads that are perhaps driving some of the more common instances of anger, if you can draw that conclusion? Yeah,
shoulding bears a word or two. Shoulding is a weird way to put it, isn't it?
It is.
It's not weird for me, but maybe for some of the listeners. Look, shoulding just means sentences essentially with the word should in it. Like, you should comply with my request, and this idiot shouldn't, turn into my lane without indicating. My wife shouldn't have forgotten to pick up the milk on the way home, and you shouldn't speak to me in that tone. And you should have remembered my birthday. You should have noticed my hair was different.
My children should just do what they're asked to first time.
Yeah, they should work harder. They should never lie to me. So every instance of anger I've ever come across can be reduced to one such sentence with a should in it. It's not that you consciously are thinking that in your head. In fact, consciously, you might be thinking more about your response to it. But this is what's called an unconscious belief or appraisal that's triggered. That's what we're really trying to get at. Cognitively, that's what's doing the heavy lifting. We want to sort of reverse engineer from what triggered your anger, what demand or expectation you must have in your head. You know, if your kid's on his mobile at the dinner table, and you say, put that down, Jesus. Yeah, clearly you can reverse engineer what the should there is. You shouldn't have your mobile at the dinner table, or you should be wide-eyed and attentive and enjoying this meal as a family, and you should be interacting with me. And you shouldn't be more interested in whatever it is you're doing there than you are. But it's hard to know because, it could be any one of those. And that's why you need to triangulate with all the other triggers to see, so which one is it? But normally people can actually just tell you when you ask. You can do a bit of digging and get it. Which one is it? Is it that you think he shouldn't care more about his friends than about his family? Or is it that you just have a view that he shouldn't be on devices generally and it wasn't about him doing it at the dinner table? Is it that you've asked him before and he shouldn't be non-compliant with a request? What is it? Which aspect of that is it that you're most angry about? So you drill down like that from your reactions. Like a detective, you try to work out, so that must be my should, my rule. Because all anger is triggered by rule breaks, someone violating a norm in your head to how people should behave. And of course, ultimately then, we have a look at these norms themselves. And this is when we get a little more philosophical in the book. What are these norms? Where's it written? How do you know that that's absolutely the way people should behave? I mean, you must have just acquired that norm. You can't have been, wired into the human brain because people don't agree. There's a lot of difference of opinion. First and foremost, the person doing the thing can't possibly agree. As we know, these norms differ greatly, not only from country to country, like, say, taking your shoes off in a restaurant or other such things, sex before marriage, some communities, smoking marijuana in others, all these things over which there are differences of opinion, but differ even just from suburb to suburb, or from household to household.
Generation to generation.
Oh, my goodness, definitely generation to generation. That's why there are these battles of the generations, but these battles between parents and children a lot of the time. Especially, I think, when norms change very rapidly. I can only imagine, casting my mind back to our prehistory, that norms can't have changed that quickly when we were hunter-gatherers. I just can't imagine there being new devices every 5 years. New kinds of bows and arrows, or new kinds of hunting techniques or gathering techniques, or the raspberries came into fashion. I just can't imagine that children and parents would have had very different norms. And so I can imagine there would have been less of a clash of generations back then. But these days, take something like just clothing. I mean, the millennials have views about what it's appropriate for 15-year-old girls to wear that their 50-year-old mothers are likely to disagree with. Music, of course, we know. And if you take what's top of our charts now, by Cardi B, WAP, I think it's called. I won't spell it out. But what is perfectly acceptable and funny and maybe seen as an empowering statement for one generation is just seen as soft porn by another name and indecorous by another.
And that is confronting, isn't it? I think that is, I have a 12-year-old son, and I try really hard to take a wise, thoughtful approach to this and think about the fact that, what he listens to, whilst by certainly the standards I was growing up by, could be considered abhorrent.
Yeah.
And all of those things that you've just described, but trying to place that in a context of a different generation of, is it helpful to try and stop him from listening to that, given that he will be exposed to it in so many ways elsewhere anyway? What do we do? Is it about having a conversation? But it is confronting to actually look at your child and hear what they're hearing. And even sometimes for me to hear what's played on the radio without wanting to feel like I'm an old fuddy-duddy. I'm kind of like, well.
Nothing makes me feel older than the current state of music. It's different. It's definitely different.
And so if what you're saying is that if we're terribly rigid, perhaps about these shoulds, they shouldn't listen to that music, that is wrong, that is bad. As soon as we have that as a kind of an underlying belief, whether we are able to articulate that yet or not, that's where that kind of rigidity can cause this kind of conflict.
It's not just rigidity, it's righteousness. Righteousness is believing that your opinion, essentially, is fact, is just the way it is. It's just right. The way you just phrased it earlier when you said the standards I grew up with were different from... You're already there. You're already that much more enlightened. Clearly, you've just articulated that it's that arbitrary. It's just about if I'd been born later or sooner, I'd think differently about it. You can then voice it. You might still disagree with certain things and you can make a case for or against it, but you'll do so without righteous indignation. You'll do so, I think, without anger. You'll just talk to him, try to meet with someone from a different culture with interest and with a free exchange of ideas and opinions, but that's all there'll be. You won't be knocking on doors and writing angry letters and protesting. You'll just be going, that's different. Let me try to understand this. Similarly with the expectations and rules people bring into relationships about what's right and wrong, or about gender roles, or about work ethic, or about what a good friend should or shouldn't do, or about respect to which I'm entitled because I'm this kind of person, or I've done these sorts of things. Shoulds about fairness and deservedness, respect, entitlement. Any of them can be viewed with a little detachment, I think. And I think it is just so much more helpful to do that than to just bunker in and go, no, that's just not the way things are done. It shouldn't be that way. I know what I'm talking about. I don't care, mate. It's just wrong. It's just wrong. You're right that there is some rigidity to it too, isn't there? So you just can't see outside. You're blinkered. You can only see your own view. It just can't even occur to you that was arbitrary. It just happened to be the way you were brought up on that street in that town at that time. And we see that in the religious. I don't want to get into too contentious an area, but there's a difference between those who hold their religious beliefs lightly and will say things like, well, you're entitled to your own beliefs and I respect all religions and so on, versus those who just believe that they hold the absolute truth. And it's remarkable that it doesn't occur to them they might hold something else to be absolutely true if they've been born elsewhere. It's so obvious that they're inculcated into it.
So at our house, we often talk about the accident of birth.
Yeah.
That you happen to get born into a religion, for example, or a family cultural scenario that could be quite different if you had been born elsewhere or into a different family or into a different culture.
It'd be like saying that English is just the right way of expressing concepts, and that Korean or French are just aberrations. It's silly. It's a way. And it's weird to say people should speak like that. What are you saying? Instead of babbling nonsense, that's essentially what they're doing. They're just seeing all their norms and mores as set in stone, and that they are the privileged holders of the truth. That's the righteous angle. Another angle we take is what we call seeing the machine. Is we invite the reader to think less in terms of blame and shoulds and more in terms of thinking more like a scientist, like a psychologist. Why? Causes and solutions. When, say, I don't know, your partner gambles or something, and you could just very lazily say, that's bad, you shouldn't do that. All right. He might disagree. He might say, I think I'm entitled. And we know that's a matter for opinion. But what you're not doing in that moment also is getting into the whys and wherefores. What's prompted him to get into this? Why does he not see it the way I do? Why does he not see that it's, that the house always wins? How can he believe that this is... And there's a whole field of study of gambling and of the mechanisms that underlie it, some of the superstitious patterns of thinking and also the neurochemistry underlying it and the learning research about intermittent reinforcement. And there's a whole field. And if you were to see it more through the lens of a scientist, what has caused this behavior? Same with, say, if your partner is not sexually responsive, you could just be that dickhead husband who says, you should put out, you're my wife, conjugal duties, and she may disagree. And we can get into that debate. And as we know, that's all arbitrary. And if he's righteous, that's its own problem. But a second way of looking at it is to stop and wonder why, because it matters. Is this because she's just stressed and run down, or has she fallen out of love, or is there a problem with what's going on in the bedroom? It's worth actually investigating instead of just getting angry. It's silly to think more causes, and to see people's behavior more as just the inevitable product of their influences and their personality styles and whatever factors are at play. Think more deterministically. See the machine is the way we put it. See the cogs and levers, causes of things, and try to nut out solutions. That sounds very Spock-like and rational. But one can only aspire to be a little more rational in the way we go about these things, which are so emotionally fraught. I think there's a lot to be said for being a little less righteous and judgy in the first place, and then trying to understand the thing rather than condemn it. And finally, the third piece is empathy. It's more intuitively try to get the other person's point of view. And when you understand the point of view of someone who you're angry with, it's much harder to condemn them, to be angry. And there's often a lack of empathy in the angry, often because they don't even bother trying, frankly, to understand. They don't think they should have to understand their partner's point of view because it's wrong what they're doing. Who cares why they're doing it? And who cares what they're feeling? It's just wrong. It should stop. But you need to understand your opponent. You need to understand your rival and the person who's wronging you. Otherwise, you're not informed. You can't negotiate with them. You can't solve the problem properly.
So a 3-step process, what's sort of coming to my mind is this sort of, an awareness of if you're selling yourself or someone else that it's my way or the highway, just that kind of righteousness piece. There's only one way to do this and I know the right way and you're either on board or you're not. Yeah. And if you're not on board, then you're of no consequence to me in some way, shape or form.
And you're wrong.
And you're wrong. And you deserve to be told.
Yeah.
Then it's about at least having an awareness that perhaps that's where your mindset is, your thoughts and opinions are, then perhaps being able to step back from that and actually look at all of the pieces in this scenario that, looking at the machine, well, what else might be at play here? Is this helping me? I suppose is even a question perhaps we ought to be asking in there is, is this behavior helping me? Am I getting to where, which is sort of where our conversation started out? What are the other factors in play? Why might they be behaving in this way? Will this get me to where I really want to be? Are there other ways of approaching that? And then that empathy piece of, what might they be thinking, which I know is hard for people, isn't it? We talk about empathy kind of almost in a flippant sort of way. I know certainly in workplaces, empathy, what is empathy, blah, blah, blah. But, actually being able to imagine, and I always describe it as being a cognitively complex thing to do because you're not just imagining being in somebody else's shoes, you actually have to imagine being them in their shoes.
Exactly. That's exactly right. And that's one of the other errors I think that a lot of angry people make. They say, I wouldn't do that. Yeah, you wouldn't. But they would, clearly, since they did. I mean, what kind of argument is that? That's right. That's not empathy, just to imagine that you were in the same scenario, in the same situation, and how you'd act, because it's to imagine you were that person in that scenario. And by the way, if you were, then you would have done exactly what they did.
Yeah.
Unless you feel you'd keep some little bit of you in there, you wouldn't. You'd be them, wouldn't you?
And therefore you can understand their perspective, their point of view, what drove their behaviour, et cetera, et cetera.
And I agree that a lot of the time empathy failure is one of just not having the repertoire. Men failing to understand women or vice versa, and adults failing to understand children or having forgotten what it's like because it's many years ago that they were a child and it's buried in the annals of time. It's not understanding someone of a different culture or someone else at work. But a lot of the time, I honestly think it's not that you couldn't empathize, it's just that you don't. You choose not to. I honestly think that, especially since, most of our anger is directed at our loved ones whom we know well and over stuff that's pretty simple to empathize. A lot of it isn't really difficult things that most people couldn't get their head around or understand. It's pretty simple stuff. If you don't feel like sex, there's no man who can't understand what that's like. And the thrill, the rush of thinking you could win at the pokies is not that difficult a concept. And I don't think it's hard to understand an oversight, like just driving home and not thinking about getting the milk, even though you got the reminder an hour earlier. I just don't think that's, I can't get my head around why. It's just that they don't go there. And it's an interesting thing, empathy, because what makes someone empathize or not empathize, often empathy is almost a choice. It's almost a kind act in itself. And if you're angry, you're in quite the opposite mindset. You're not feeling disposed to thinking charitably, almost in the other person's defense, right? You're feeling antagonistic. And the last thing you want to do is really enter into their worldview and try to unpack it. And a lot of angry people, when I do couples work, they sort of resist those tasks, where you have to try to state your partner's point of view. They resist it. They don't want to do it. They say, no, why? And also, when they do finally come around to doing it, they do so easily, often to their partner's surprise. Their partner will say, oh, so you do get it. And they'll say, well, of course I get it, but
I chose not to. And is that partly because, we spoke before about what happens when we're angry and how we lose a lot of that kind of cognitive capacity to problem solve and innovate and negotiate. Is that we lose our capacity for empathy at the same time?
I actually think that in this instance, it's not so much we do also lose the capacity, agreed, which is because we get into very low res thinking and our imagination is shot. But we also lose the motivation, because anger inspires antagonism. Just like with all emotions, there's a package. You get physiological symptoms and you also get behavioral concomitants. Fear, for example, you're motivated to escape and to avoid the threat. And in anger, you're motivated against the wrongdoer, antagonistically. So you're motivated to strike against in some way. And so that motivation, even if you did have your cognitive faculties fully online, it goes entirely against a little exercise like trying to understand their point of view, which for most people is sort of more, they'd put it under the category of kindness. And that's why I try to tell angry people that empathizing is not an act of kindness. It's just smart. That's like the Godfather says, keep your friends close and your enemies closer. It's that sort of idea that to negotiate well with someone, or even just to interact with them at all, you need to understand them well. Even just to plan a convincing argument to influence them, you have to understand their point of view. Even to market to someone, right? You need to understand what they want. Market research is not a benevolent gesture. Market research is not an altruistic action for the consumers. No. They are taking notes on what the consumers want and what they need so that they can better, well, I don't want to say exploit, it's a bit cynical, but better create a product that's going to sell.
Attain their purpose.
Yes, that's right. Similarly, empathy is not just a benevolent act. It's purely and simply to be informed about the inner world of the person you're interacting with or, in conflict with. So I try to unpick that piece, the resistance around empathizing. Of course, if you're angry enough, you also don't have the cognitive capacity to empathize anyway, because you don't have the cognitive capacity to do anything, essentially, except
be angry.
Hit and be angry. But yeah, so there's a sort of a double problem there in empathizing.
So being able to step back, I suppose, what you're saying is that we have the opportunity, if you're looking at the motivation to change your beliefs, behaviour around anger, it's as much strategic and tactical as it is about feelings.
I was desperately self-conscious of not wanting to write a book that essentially told angry people, you should be less angry for other people's sake. Of course, for other people's sake. But I just felt like there are too many books that get on angry people's backs about people don't like you and you should get less angry for your spouse's sake. And as soon as someone thinks they're doing something, not for themselves, but for someone else, and they're not sold to it themselves, that's sort of a weak motivation. It's extrinsic motivation rather than intrinsic motivation, if you will.
Yeah.
I want them to really see that it's for them too. And quite fortunately, quite happily, for those around them. So I always try to make really compelling arguments that the angry person really can benefit from all this. And of course, those around him or her will do so as well.
Stephen, this has been a fascinating conversation. We've gone over an hour now and I could keep talking. I have lots of other things I could ask you.
So could I. Don't get me started on this topic.
Well, I have. Yeah. Maybe we'll have to come back and do it again and continue on from here at some other point. But anytime. For the moment, we might have to wind it up. It has been fascinating. The book is The Anger Fallacy, Uncovering the Irrationality of the Angry Mindset. And it does have an associated workbook that comes with it. And we'll put the links to the show notes to that and some links to where to find out a little bit more about you. I really, really appreciate your time today. I appreciate your thoughtfulness and obviously your expertise around what is a complex topic, but I think you've done a wonderful job of explaining it in a straightforward and simple and usable way, which is what we always seek to achieve here on the Potential Psychology podcast. Let's make, some of these complex topics practical and useful and usable. And for that, I sincerely thank you on behalf of both my audience and myself.
My pleasure. It's been fun.
And perhaps we can continue this conversation at another time.
Anytime.
Excellent. So it turns out that anger really doesn't serve us. Something for us all to think about when we feel anger or irritation or frustration rising. I'm certainly going to remind myself that there are smarter ways of achieving the outcome I'm looking for, ways that benefit both parties next time something or someone is frustrating me. Stephen's book is The Anger Fallacy, Uncovering the Irrationality of the Angry Mindset, co-authored with Professor Ross Menzies and published by Australian Academic Press. You'll find a link to the book and Stephen's website in the show notes for today's episode. And there's also a link to review this podcast. As I mentioned in our last episode, we've finally found a way to make leaving a podcast review easier. And I'd really love it if you would do exactly that. I do read and very much appreciate every review. And it makes it so much easier for others to find out about the show and our wonderful guests and the wisdom and knowledge that they share when we have recent and plentiful reviews. So when you get a moment, right now, if it's practical, pop over to reviewthispodcast.com/potential. You'll get a simple form that asks for a title, a brief review, and a 5-star rating. Oh, 5-star rating, a rating out of 5. Feel free to give me a 5-star rating if you'd like. You can then choose to share your review on Podchaser, Apple Podcasts, or Stitcher. And you are done. Quick, simple, much appreciated, and very helpful. We'll put that link in the show notes again, but it's an easy one to remember. It's reviewthispodcast.com/potential. Thank you. Okay, so what do we have coming up in our next episode? Well, we're talking about the brain again. We've had a little flurry on episodes about the brain, haven't we? And this time, we're talking about something you might never have considered, and that is our physical intelligence. What is it in our brain that stops us from walking into walls or off cliffs? How do you pick the right moment to cross a busy road or decide if you can drive through a storm? And what helps you to discover a shortcut to a familiar route? These are all attributes of our physical intelligence, what my guest, neuroscientist, neurologist and author Scott Grafton describes as a silent, ruthless intellect that we all possess. It's really thought-provoking stuff, and it's coming up in episode 88 of the show, hitting the airwaves on November 11. So until then, stay safe, go well, do everything in your power to fulfill your potential in even the smallest ways. Leave a review of the show, please, and we'll be back in your ears in a couple of weeks.